Now our next speaker before the break, our last speaker before the break, is Dr. Joshua Mitchell from Georgetown University. He's currently professor of political theory at Georgetown. And the title of Dr. Mitchell's talk is The Founders, American Revolution, and the Early Republic. Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for attending. I'm actually not going to talk about that period. I'm a Tocqueville scholar, but I teach history of Western political philosophy from Plato to the present day. I've also been in the university trenches for 20 years or so. And I've seen a development which I'm quite concerned about, and which is the development which brings me here today. I will talk a bit about the liberal thought that informed the founders, but what I'm most concerned about here is identity politics and how it now consumes our nation. Identity politics, I'm going to suggest very briefly here, and I'll give some details, is religion in a way dressed up as politics. In its defense, I will say it speaks to the deepest longings we have, which is the longing for justice. However, I think it's ultimately a deeply harmful way of conceiving of the problem of justice. I think it's profoundly harmful to African Americans who are used as a template for identity politics, and then it's extended beyond them. I think it precludes a return to earnest covenantal thinking or any sort of serious theological thinking in America. I think that the innocents that are now named in identity politics sooner or later become transgressors, that nobody's safe, that we have to think through this in a very profound way, because unless we're able to do this, our nation is really going to be eaten alive with one group after another being called out as transgressors. And again, while I'm going to be highly critical of this, I want to assure you that the impulse behind identity politics is the one I want to preserve, namely the longing for justice. Throughout history, the human race is divided into nations, into different kinds of peoples having different inheritances. As recently as the 1960s, we identified ourselves as distinct kinds of Americans. He's American, she's French. This was not limited to political distinctions alone. We treated religion this way. He's Protestant, she's Roman Catholic. Even ethnic distinctions were handled in this manner. He's Phoenician, she's Viking. Racial distinctions too. I'm of this. As we entered the 1990s, however, a new term inexplicably appeared in our everyday vocabulary: identity. The term is now used everywhere. And anyone who's old enough to remember knows that we used to talk about ourselves and about the world without even knowing the term. But now we say my identity is American, my gender identity is male, my religious identity is Protestant, my ethnic identity is Phoenician. What's going on here? Why add the term identity when a generation or so ago it seemed completely unnecessary? In its more innocent usage, the term identity is an upgrade and a kind of fashionable equivalent for kind. To be an American today, though, is to have an American identity. With this meaning in mind, when critics suggest that the term is unnecessary or pernicious, the usual response is that people have had identities for all of human history, and so it's impossible to eliminate the term. I think that response is understandable, but only when identity is used synonymously with kind and has no further meaning. Identity, though, has a second meaning, which is quite different from kind, without which we would probably not even use the term today, and would not have been used in the 1990s. This other meaning is not so much a specification of kind as it is a specification of a relationship. More importantly, the relationship is of a specific kind with discernible religious overtones, the unpayable debt one kind owes another. When identity is a mere proxy for kind, Lebanese identity, say, is one kind and French identity is another, and nothing more be said. When identity takes on the second meaning, something different is involved. Lebanese and French now stand in a relationship to one another. One is the offending transgressor, the other is the innocent victim. Moreover, Lebanese and French meet not just for this moment of the encounter, but permanently. Like the stain of original sin that marks Adam and all of his progeny, the transgressor is permanently marked. He himself may have done nothing to contribute to the transgressions that preceded him by decades or even centuries, doesn't matter. He stands for, think of Adamic language here, he stands for the sum of the transgressions linked to that identity. Pressing Christian imagery further, like Christ, the transgressor stands in for those who are purportedly innocent and covers over, you know the theological references here, their stains so that no judgment against their identity may be rendered. This second kind of understanding of identity is more often what we mean today when we use the term. Identity politics has no single proponent. It's less a single theory than a large genus which in all theories of victimhood are species, because all of them invoke the relationship between transgressor and innocent. Identity politics began penetrating the vernacular in the 1990s, and since then, at an ever-escalating pace, more and more people have self-consciously used the term with the view to revealing the unseeing, scapegoating society that the transgressions that they, the innocent, have endured. Identity politics in America began to emerge because of the collapse of the mainline Protestant churches, which shunted the idea of transgression and innocence from religion to politics. It emerged because of the extension to other groups after the Civil Rights era of the African-American template of innocence, rightly so, which served political brokers who benefited from speaking on their behalf. And it emerged because of the discovery in the academic left in America of European postmodern thought, which provided a framework more powerful than Marxism did for attacking the legitimacy of historical inheritance. Identity politics is now incorporated into the heart of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, however, is not the source of it. To justify being heard in America today, we must demonstrate our special standing as an innocent victim. Having demonstrated that, we can take our legitimate place in the political firmament and become activists, committed in our hearts, but seldom in our daily actions to social justice. There's much to say about this. I would, if I had a lot of time, which I don't, I'd contrast this idea to what I call the liberal citizen. Liberalism is an experiment that begins not more than a few hundred years ago. It's an answer to aristocracy and to monarchy. The view is that we are citizens who have to build a world together. And if I were to have more time, I would distinguish between the identity politics of innocence versus the liberal politics of competence. And ultimately, what I would suggest to you is that there's no possible way we can build a world by simply calling out innocents because they eventually become the transgressors. We cannot build a world this way. The only way we can build a world is if we actually have to build a world face to face in terms of everyday dealings with our neighbors and build a world together. Now, we should be clear what this liberal aspiration to self-interested citizen really requires of us. Already, as early as the mid-17th century, when it became obvious that we could not return to ancient virtues, political thinkers understood that self-interest had to involve something more than self-satisfied citizens, imagining themselves to be the center of the world, feeling good about themselves just the way they are. This, by the way, is where we are today. I call it the configuration, which I won't go into detail right now. The world we're living in is what I call management society and selfie man, where no task is something that we can handle because we have to hand it off to the global managers, and yet we are so important that we take selfies of ourselves all day long. In other words, there's no room in this management society and selfie man world for us working together face to face as neighbors to solve our real problems. Now, one of the things I worry about, and that Tocqueville, who's the thinker I've been fixed on since 1989, is that as we become more and more isolated, what happens is that our imaginations start to wander. And when our imaginations start to wander, and our imagination, unlike in the case of the Greeks, who thought that imagination was this wonderful thing, you read Plato's Republic, we have to imagine a world beyond the cave. I think within a Christian context, there's a certain suspicion of imagination. So the flood was sent because they became vain in their imaginations. In this American context, when you let the imagination wander, you get these ossified categories that do not move. You get black, white, Hispanic, male, female, the rich, the poor, which are nascent and unformed until elites form them in certain ways for their own purposes. And the liberal citizen would say, this is really, really dangerous because the imagination will always build a caricatured version of the other, always. And so liberal citizens know better to settle for this illusion. Liberal citizens are active, not passive. That's the antidote to the contrived categories that always fix in our mind. Like knowledge of the future, knowledge of their fellow citizens emerges, in this case through actual face-to-face engagements with them. Formalities can and should inform their engagements, but the biggest problem now today, certainly on college campuses and everywhere else, is that the manner in which these different groups identify as or meet is wholly choreographed. There's no real engagement. And so we need to let go of the choreography and recognize that we're going to make mistakes in our encounters, and yet if we're committed to building a world together, and I think localism and federalism are so very important in this, we can't do this only nationally, then we're going to pick ourselves up after we make our mistakes. My kids at school these days are frightened to death to make mistakes. And this is the biggest problem that we all face now. We have to be able to understand that the Christian understanding is that there's transgression, and yet there's also forgiveness. And the structure of history unfolds in such a way that transgression can only be made good on if there's forgiveness, atonement, and repentance. We've forgotten that, and so we've come to a dead halt with choreographed manners of encountering one another. This cannot do. We must go beyond this. Now, if I had to put a title on this, I would say that we're living in the midst of a third great awakening without God and without forgiveness. The first two great awakenings brought religious renewal. The third awakening, through which we're now living, comprehends politics through the categories of religion, has no place for the God who judges or the God who forgives, and has brought America to a dead end beyond which no one can see. Identity politics renders judgment not based on things done and things left undone, but on publicly visible, unalterable attributes that precede whatever citizens might do or leave undone. Identity politics offers no forgiveness for transgressions because they are irredeemable. We should be clear why identity politics has overwhelmed liberal politics in the first place. It warrants our attention that the West remains under the spell of Christian categories of transgression and innocence, even if its churches no longer play the part they once did of providing a compelling account of just where and how transgression and innocence play out in the world and in eternity. Pondering the future of the West in 1887, Nietzsche wrote, "It's the church and not its poison that offends us," meaning we enlightened seculars. By this he meant that in his own century and the next several centuries, the West would neither quite renounce Christianity nor return to it. The recent appearance of identity politics in America and in Europe, the politics, but not the theology of transgression and innocence, confirms Nietzsche's prophecy. Nietzsche thought that only the weak and resentful would need to understand their world in terms of transgression and innocence. Alternatively, and I think this is superior, however much the weak and resentful might misappropriate these categories, the central question to which the West has always been concerned, namely, why are the scales of injustice perpetually out of balance, cannot be addressed without them. If Christianity itself is not hospitable to these categories because the churches want only cheerfulness these days, then transgression and innocence will work their way into politics, where justice is also a question, to the happy contentment of all the pew people, the pew nuns that are out there, who think they're not religious, but they are. They don't find transgression and innocence in the churches, they find it in the Democratic Party. So, the disequilibrium of Christianity since the Enlightenment, the inability to fully repudiate or fully embrace religious inheritance of the West, has made it difficult for many in America and Europe to sleep well at night. Compounding this debilitation has been the twin development that could not have risen to prominence at a more inopportune moment. On both sides of the Atlantic, citizens are haunted by the historical wounds their nations have authored. In America, the wound of slavery; in Europe, the wound of colonialism. At the very moment when these historical wounds highlighted the need to make all things new. To what healing power could transgressors appeal? More than a half century after the civil rights movement reawakened our understanding, at least a public understanding, I'll say largely among whites, because of the TV and because of all the injustice that was seen with the fire hoses, and the wound of colonialism in Europe became fully visible, let's say with Francis Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. The answer given by identity politics is that no healing power whatsoever is available. What of the aggrieved innocents? Because forgiveness has been banished, their portion is unyielding and unending rage. This volatile configuration without hope of resolution has unleashed the ancient furies of Greek and Roman mythology, who indiscriminately punish all the parties identity politics has in its sights with madness. The Greeks and the Romans of old, and the Hebrews and the Christians too, knew that divine things were not to be trifled with. Identity politics elicits man's deepest longings for justice in a broken world, the resolution of which was long understood to be so mysterious, so awesome, so apocalyptic, that justice was placed out of mortal reach. Identity politics dares to tamper with this somber and reverential insight and puts justice within man's grasp. Those who believe they have a grip on it, those who think they can use it for political ends, do not understand that identity politics will turn against all who enlist it. They that sow the wind shall reap the whirlwind. Now, I spent some time, I'm running out of time, and I know that the panel has gone longer, and I know you need a break, so I'm going to cut my remarks a bit short. What I am going to suggest, though, is that, that we're already seeing the beginning of a move in terms of who are the innocents and who are the transgressors. So what's interesting about Christianity is that there's one innocent scapegoat, and all the rest of us are transgressors. When identity politics makes that configuration of transgression and innocence imminent, first what you have to do is identify a distinct group, which has been identified. But the task here is to purge the transgressors. And I play with the experiment, or I play with the question, what would happen if the prime transgressor, the white heterosexual male, is finally sufficiently pushed to the background? Then who would be the next transgressor? Because I think this is the question. Because the identity politics needs a scapegoat. It's deeply theological. Just as Christ was the scapegoat, so too identity politics needs a scapegoat. Now, I do not wish to, please do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying the white heterosexual man is innocent, please. No. I'm saying we're all guilty, okay? But what happens when you immanentize this understanding of transgression and innocence, what happens is once you purge or sufficiently move one group to the side, you're going to have the next group. And my guess is the next one is going to be the white heterosexual female, and so I think in the Democratic Party, the days of Pelosi, Elizabeth Warren, Hillary Clinton, I think that's over. And I think the next group are going to be, if Kevin Hart's recent whatever you call it, the Academy Awards thing, that he had comedic routines about gay men in his disability. I think it's going to be the black heterosexual male is going to be the next one. Look, this just goes on and on and on. And I think the problem with identity politics is that it starts from the template of the wound of slavery. And then it says, as this template was, as this group was, so now this and this and this. And I want to suggest that those other groups who want to say they too have been harmed need to look for a different model. That in fact, the African-American wound is the singular wound that the Americans have to deal with. And that I would suggest that the inner truth of Black Lives Matter, which I will say I think is in some ways confused, but the inner truth of it, in my view, is that it spoke to the Democratic Party, which started out with a proper understanding that the single wound that we have to attend to as a nation is the African-American slavery wound, whites, masters, all that. That relationship has to be completely eradicated. And then the brokers stepped in and decided they would use that template. And the African-Americans were asked, you know my reference, to step to the back of the bus so that other groups could get on the front. I think this is a terrible, terrible mistake. And I frankly think the only group that has moral authority to put an end to identity politics are African-Americans, who can say to all those who have stepped up after them, no, this is the singular wound. And everybody else, if you want to raise it, you raise it, but not by invoking us. I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell.